Chapter 8. The Journey into Slavery. Joseph was made Pharaoh's grand vizier at the age of 30, and he was put in charge of preparing the whole nation of Egypt for the impending drought. God showed Joseph how to organize and manage the planting and harvesting of crops, how to build vast canals to divert the Nile's water into the desert, and how to design and construct vast silos for storing the crops. At the end of the 7 years of plenty came the promised 7 years of drought and famine. Archaeologists have found ancient writings describing these years. The drought was so severe that the sands of the desert blew across the land in huge, billowing clouds that blackened out the sun. The drought and famine not only confined to the land of Egypt, it reached out through the surrounding lands. In the land of Canaan, Joseph's family was feeling the effects of the famine. Their crops did not yield any harvest, and their barns were empty. Special news spread that Egypt had a wise grand vizier who had prepared for this drought by storing massive amounts of provisions. In the 2nd year of the famine, Israel heard the news and sent his sons to Egypt to buy enough food to keep them from starving. Joseph saw them coming and recognized them. I imagine the flood of memories that came pouring back were not a comfort to him. The last time he had seen his brothers was the day they had sold him into slavery. The men did not recognize their brother in his Egyptian attire, and they bowed low before him. Joseph remembered the dream he had when he was a boy, dreams of his brothers bowing down to him as they are now. He accused them of being spies who had come to see how bad the drought was in Egypt. The brothers denied this and explained that they were sons of one man from Canaan. They explained that there were 12 sons. One was dead, and the other was the youngest, who was at home with their father. Joseph demanded that they prove what they said by bringing back their youngest brother with them. He also demanded that one of them stay there as a bound servant, while the others took some food back home with the command to return with the youngest. The brothers spoke amongst themselves, saying they were being punished by God for what they did to Joseph so many years earlier. Joseph commanded his servants to place his brother's money back in the sacks of the corn. When they returned home, leaving Simeon in Egypt as a ransom, they discovered their gold in the sacks and became even more afraid. Israel was an old man, and his health was not good. He had been so heartbroken over the perceived death of Joseph that he had not been well ever since. Now, when he discovered his youngest son, Benjamin, was to be taken to Egypt to prove his sons were not spies, he was so heartbroken he thought he would die. After their return to Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph commanded that they be brought to his home to dine with him. The brothers were afraid because they thought for sure they were to be killed or imprisoned by this man, who seemed determined to find them guilty of spying. As they sat at the table, Joseph came in and saw his younger brother Benjamin for the first time in many years. He was so overwhelmed with emotion that he had to excuse himself to his bedchamber to cry. Again, Joseph sent his brothers back with corn and grain, and again he ordered their money be placed in their bags. This time, however, he ordered his servants to follow them. When his brothers had gone a short distance, the servants stopped them and brought them back to Joseph. The brothers' bags were searched, and the gold coins fell out from each bag. The brothers were so distressed that they fell to the ground in complete despair. Genesis 45 says Joseph could not refrain himself anymore. He cried out for everyone to leave him alone with these men he had framed as spies and thieves. Once all his servants were gone from the room, he wept and told his brothers who he really was. I can't imagine they thought this Egyptian man was crazy. Joseph, in his full Egyptian ruler attire, which probably included heavy eye makeup and a black wig, was not even remotely familiar to them. They had given up all hope of ever seeing their younger brother they had sold into slavery. The image of his forlorn face, drooping shoulders, and bound hands as he walked across the desert was the image they had burned into each of their minds. Now, here stood this man, saying that he was Joseph. How could it be? Joseph spoke again. This time, he reassured his brothers that God had sent him to Egypt. He begged his brothers not to be angry with themselves for selling him into slavery. What they had intended for evil, God had used to save them all from starvation. What a reunion they had. Pharaoh heard that Joseph's family had come from Canaan, and he made an offer that would change the course of history. He told Joseph to tell his father, all his brothers, their wives, and their children to come live in Egypt. Pharaoh would provide the wagons and oxen to bring back the family. Pharaoh promised he would give them a separate section of land. This land was good for growing crops and would support the whole family. This land was called Goshen, and it was prime real estate near the Nile Delta. Joseph's brothers rushed home to tell their father the wonderful news. Joseph was alive and well. He was a powerful ruler in Egypt with a family of his own. Israel and his sons and grandchildren packed up everything they owned and started the journey to Goshen. On the way, they stopped to rest for the night at a place called Beersheba. Here, God appeared to Israel in a dream and told him not to be afraid to go to Egypt. God told him he would be with him and make them a great nation. The Lord also told Israel he would bring them back to Canaan, the land God promised to Abraham. It was in this way that Joseph's family, the children of Israel, came to live in Egypt. There were many of them by this time. Each of the 12 brothers had children, and some of those children had children. Genesis 46:27 says there was 70, including the 2 sons of Joseph who were born in Egypt. This means there were 70 members in the family. When Joseph heard his family was coming to Egypt, he ordered his chariot be prepared so that he could meet his father. What a happy reunion this was. Joseph and his father embraced and wept. Neither of them had thought they would see each other again. The family of Israel were shepherds by occupation. Joseph, who was wise to the traditions and opinions of Egypt, warned his father and brothers that to be a shepherd was considered an abomination to the Egyptians. Therefore, he said they must say they were cattle traders if anyone, especially Pharaoh, asked them what their occupation was. The famine continued for 5 more long years, and people from far and wide came to Egypt to buy grain. Little by little, Joseph brought up cattle and land in exchange for seed, corn, and grains. By the end of the famine, the nation of Israel had vast wealth holdings. The family of Joseph prospered in the land of Goshen, while the surrounding areas were still suffering from the famine. 17 years passed, and the children of Israel grew in number. By now, Israel had grown exceedingly old. His years were 147. Before he died, Israel called Joseph to him. Joseph brought his 2 sons with him, and Israel stretched out his hands to bless them. Joseph passed his place in the family on to his 2 sons, and they formed 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. In those days, it was tradition for the father to pass down the blessings and benediction to his child. What a wonderful tradition! This was what God had called all parents to do for their children. It was their responsibility to train them up in the way they should go and to remember the landmarks. Landmarks are monumental happenings in each of our Christian lives and walks. Landmarks are symbols of Jesus' passing, his love from one generation to another. We are always only one generation away from forgetting. We must be determined not to be a forgetful generation. After Israel had passed on, Joseph had his father's body embalmed, and he and his brothers carried it back to Canaan, as Israel had asked. There they buried him in a cave tomb, where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah and Leah had all been buried. After the funeral, the brothers returned to their families in Goshen. Joseph lived to be 110 years old, and when he died, his family embalmed his body and placed it in a coffin. He had requested that he be buried in Canaan with his father and grandfathers, as Israel had done. All his brothers were dead, along with that entire generation. Their children and their grandchildren grew in number until they were a mighty people. Exodus 1:7 said they were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. By this time, the kindly Pharaoh who had been Joseph's friend had long been gone, and the attitude of the Pharaoh who was now on the Egyptian throne was not favorable toward the children of Israel. In fact, this Pharaoh was afraid because the Israelites, as they were called now, had grown to be such a mighty people. He decided to enslave them and inflict them with the burden of building treasured cities and tombs for him. He also tried to keep them from multiplying by commanding that all the boy children born to the Israelites be killed. Exodus 1:17 says the midwives, whom the Pharaoh had commanded to destroy the baby boys, feared God and did not do as the king had commanded. When the children of Israel still multiplied, the Pharaoh commanded that any Egyptian who saw an Israelite boy throw the child into the Nile River. God had a plan for these people, though. He was going to raise up a deliverer named Moses from among them and lead them back to the land he had promised Abraham.